I never thought money could erase a lifetime of shared memories. I never believed blood could feel like a stranger's hand closing a door behind you. But grief has a way of revealing who people really are. When my parent passed away, the house became quieter than I expected. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that presses against your chest and makes breathing feel intentional. Every room still carried their presence. The chair where they sat, the hallway they walked through every morning, the smell of coffee that no longer came from the kitchen. We gathered because we had to, not because we wanted to. Grief doesn't always pull families together. Sometimes it places them in the same room and lets the tension speak for itself. My sibling sat across from me looking calm, almost too calm, hands folded, eyes steady, the kind of stillness that doesn't come from peace but from preparation. I told myself not to read into it. People grieve differently. That's what I repeated in my head. I didn't want suspicion to taint the last fragile thread holding us together. The will was supposed to be simple. That's what we were told. Equal, fair, clear. Our parent believed in balance. They believed siblings should never be placed on opposite sides of a line drawn by money. I heard them say it more than once. They didn't want inheritance to become a wound that never healed. So I walked into that moment with trust, not excitement, not greed, just trust. When the lawyers spoke, the words didn't land right away. Sometimes shock doesn't feel dramatic. Sometimes it arrives quietly and sits with you before you understand what it's doing. Most of the estate had already been transferred, accounts moved, property signed over. Decisions made without my knowledge. I remember blinking once, twice, as if clarity would return if I tried hard enough. My sibling didn't look at me, not once. The explanation came wrapped in practicality. They said it was temporary. They said they were just helping manage things. They said paperwork was complicated. They said they assumed I wouldn't mind. That assumption hurt more than the loss itself. I asked one question, just one. Why wasn't I told? The room felt smaller after that, like the walls leaned in to listen. They said they didn't think it was necessary. They said everything would work out. They said we could talk about it later. Later is a word people use when they don't intend to return anything. I went home that night carrying more than grief. I carried disbelief. I carried confusion. I carried the first crack in something I thought was unbreakable. I replayed childhood memories I didn't ask to remember, sharing rooms, sharing secrets, defending each other when the world felt unfair. We were supposed to be on the same side. That was the unspoken agreement of being siblings. But agreements mean nothing when silence replaces honesty. Over the next few days, the truth revealed itself slowly. Bank statements, property records, legal confirmations that turned suspicion into certainty. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't temporary. It wasn't confusion. It was taken. Not just money, not just assets, but trust, history, the belief that family protects its own. I didn't confront them right away. Part of me hoped there was a missing piece, some explanation that would soften the reality. But explanations never came. Only distance, calls went unanswered, messages stayed unread. The silence felt familiar in a way I didn't expect. Grief has stages people talk about: denial, anger, bargaining, acceptance. No one tells you betrayal has its own timeline. I felt foolish for not seeing it sooner. I questioned every past interaction, every conversation where money had been mentioned casually, every moment I had trusted without hesitation. The worst part wasn't the loss itself. It was realizing how easily I had been excluded, how quietly decisions were made about something that belonged to both of us. I wondered how long they had planned it. Weeks, months, years, or maybe opportunity is enough to change someone. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want a fight. I wanted acknowledgement, an admission that what happened was wrong. Instead, I received avoidance. Family members offered advice that didn't help. Let it go. It's just money. Don't ruin relationships over inheritance. They didn't understand that the inheritance wasn't the issue. The silence was. The deception was. The ease with which I had been erased from decisions that shaped our shared past. I started sleeping less, thinking more, replaying conversations that now felt rehearsed. Grief layered itself on top of betrayal until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. I asked myself a question I never expected to ask. If someone who shares your blood can do this, what does family really mean? That question stayed with me. It followed me into quiet mornings. It sat beside me during sleepless nights. I didn't know then that this was only the beginning. That what came next would test not just my patience, but my understanding of forgiveness itself. Because theft can be proven on paper, but forgiveness requires something much harder, and my sibling wasn't finished yet. I waited longer than I should have before reaching out. Part of me hoped time would soften whatever decision had been made. Another part hoped my sibling would come forward on their own, that they would call, that they would explain, that they would say something that made this feel less intentional. But silence has a way of answering questions without words. Every day that passed without contact made the truth heavier. Not because I needed the money immediately, but because each unanswered message felt like confirmation. Confirmation that what had happened wasn't an accident, it was a choice. I finally called, not angry, not calm either. Somewhere in between, where your voice sounds steady but your chest feels tight. They answered after the third ring. Their tone was polite, careful, as if they already knew why I was calling. I didn't accuse, I didn't raise my voice. I asked for clarity. I asked for honesty. I asked why decisions were made without me, why accounts were moved, why property was transferred solely into their name. There was a pause, long enough to feel deliberate. Then came explanations layered with reassurance. They said they were protecting things. They said they didn't want complications. They said I was being emotional because of grief. That word landed hard. Emotional, as if pain invalidates facts, as if grief makes someone incapable of understanding reality. I told them I wasn't confused. I told them I had documents. I told them I knew exactly what had been done. The tone shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Defensiveness replaced reassurance. They reminded me of things they had done for our parent, appointments they attended, responsibilities they carried, sacrifices they believed I hadn't made. It wasn't a conversation anymore, it was a justification. I listened longer than I should have, not because I agreed, but because I wanted to understand how someone convinces themselves that betrayal is deserved. They said they felt entitled, not in those words, but entitlement doesn't always announce itself clearly. Sometimes it hides behind stories of effort and resentment. They said they deserved more. They said fairness is subjective. They said I could always take legal action if I wanted. That sentence ended the conversation emotionally, even if the call continued. Because when someone brings up lawyers before resolution, they've already decided where they stand. I didn't threaten. I didn't argue. I told them I needed time. Time didn't bring peace. It brought clarity. I realized something uncomfortable. The betrayal didn't start with the inheritance. It started long before that. I began remembering moments that once felt insignificant, small comments about responsibility, subtle comparisons, jokes that carried resentment underneath. Grief had simply removed the filter. I spoke to professionals. Not to start a war, but to understand my options. Every conversation confirmed the same thing. What happened wasn't a misunderstanding. It was legally calculated. That knowledge didn't empower me the way I expected. It exhausted me. I didn't want to spend years fighting someone who knew exactly how this would hurt. I didn't want to turn family history into court transcripts. But I also didn't want to disappear quietly from something that belonged to me. The pressure came from all sides. Some relatives urged me to let it go. Others encouraged me to fight. Everyone had an opinion shaped by their own fears and experiences. No one could feel what I felt. The nights were the hardest, not because of anger, but because of disbelief. How does someone sleep knowing they took advantage of a moment when grief left someone vulnerable? How does someone justify silence when honesty would have cost them nothing but pride? I tried to imagine what our parent would say. I tried to hear their voice in my head. They valued fairness. They valued transparency. I wondered if they would feel disappointed, or if they already knew something I didn't. Eventually, I asked for a meeting. Not to argue, not to accuse, but to look at each other face to face. They agreed, reluctantly. We met in a neutral place, public enough to prevent emotion from escalating, private enough to speak freely. They arrived first, sat already prepared, documents organized, confidence rehearsed. I sat down across from them and felt something unexpected, not rage, not sadness, distance, as if I were looking at someone familiar but no longer connected. I told them plainly what I knew, what I expected, what fairness meant to me. They listened, nodded, waited. Then they spoke words that changed how I saw everything. They said they didn't think I needed the money. They said my life was stable. They said they assumed I would understand. Assumptions again. I asked if they ever considered asking me. They said it would have been uncomfortable. That sentence told me more than anything else. They were willing to take everything but unwilling to have a difficult conversation. The meeting ended without resolution, no apology, no offer to correct anything, just an agreement to talk again later. Later never came, weeks passed, then months. The relationship shifted into something hollow, occasional messages, surface-level politeness, an unspoken agreement to avoid the truth. But unresolved things don't disappear. They settle into you, they affect how you trust, how you speak, how you see people. I noticed myself becoming guarded, not just with them, with everyone. I hated that. I hated that their choices were reshaping who I was. The inheritance stopped being about money entirely. It became a symbol of how easily love can be conditional, how quickly loyalty can be rewritten. I didn't know yet how this would end. I didn't know forgiveness would eventually enter the story, or that it would come in a way I never expected. At that moment, all I knew was this something had been taken that could not be returned by checks or signatures alone. And my siblings still believed time would erase it. They were wrong. After that meeting, something inside me shifted permanently, not loudly, not dramatically. It was quieter than that, like a door closing without a sound. I stopped waiting for explanations. Stopped checking my phone with expectation. Stopped hoping that decency would suddenly appear where it hadn't before. Instead, I felt the weight of something unresolved settling into my daily life. People talk about closure as if it's a moment, a conversation, a final sentence that brings peace, but closure isn't always offered. Sometimes you have to decide how much unfinished truth you're willing to carry. I went back to my routines, work, responsibilities, conversations that stayed safely on the surface. From the outside, nothing looked different, but internally, I was recalibrating everything I believed about family. I realized how deeply trust had shaped my past interactions. I had never questioned motives, never kept records, never protected myself against someone I loved. That innocence felt gone, not replaced by bitterness but by awareness. Awareness changes how you move through the world. I noticed how often people avoid difficult conversations, how easily silence is chosen over honesty, how many relationships survive only because certain truths are never spoken, and I wondered how many families carry wounds disguised as peace. The inheritance issue remained unresolved legally. I hadn't acted, not because I couldn't, but because every option felt like another loss. If I fought, I risked years of emotional exhaustion and becoming someone I didn't want to be. If I walked away, I risked validating the idea that silence wins. Neither path felt clean. Friends offered opinions. Some said money reveals true character. Others said forgiveness is freedom. A few quietly admitted they'd experienced something similar. That surprised me. Stories surfaced slowly. A sister who took advantage. A brother who disappeared after an estate was settled. A family divided over a house that once held shared memories. It seemed this kind of betrayal was more common than people admitted. No one talks about it openly because it carries shame. Shame for trusting, shame for caring, shame for being hurt by someone society tells you should be safe. I started journaling, not to document facts but to understand my emotions. Anger appeared less than I expected. Sadness appeared more. Sadness for what we used to be, for the version of my sibling I thought I knew, for the shared future that now felt impossible. I thought about childhood again. Not selectively, honestly. I noticed patterns I once ignored, moments when competition replaced closeness, times when recognition mattered more than connection. It didn't excuse anything, but it made the present less shocking. Still, knowing doesn't make it easier to accept. There were days I felt strong, resolved, certain that I didn't need acknowledgement to move forward. Then there were days I felt foolish, like I had been naive for too long, like I should have seen it coming. Grief has a way of magnifying everything. The loss of a parent had already destabilized me. The betrayal layered on top felt overwhelming at times. I found myself grieving twice. Once for my parent and once for the sibling relationship I thought was permanent. That second grief was harder to explain to others. People understand death. They struggle to understand emotional severance. You're expected to move on quietly, to accept it as part of adulthood, to be mature. But maturity doesn't erase pain. It just teaches you how to carry it without making noise. Months passed without progress. The inheritance remained untouched by resolution. Our communication remained minimal. Then something unexpected happened. I received a message late one evening, short, unusual. They wanted to talk, not about logistics, not about legalities. They said they wanted to talk honestly. That word stood out, honestly. I didn't respond immediately. I reread the message several times, tried to hear intention through text. Part of me wanted to ignore it. Another part wanted answers I knew might never come. I agreed to meet again. This time it felt different before a single word was spoken. They seemed less prepared, less composed. The confidence I remembered was gone, replaced by something heavier. They spoke first, slowly, carefully. They said things hadn't worked out the way they expected. They said managing everything alone was harder than they thought. They said pressure had built in ways they hadn't anticipated. I listened, not with hope but with attention. Then they said something that surprised me. They admitted they felt guilty, not fully, not completely, but enough to acknowledge discomfort. They said they hadn't expected the silence to feel this heavy. They said they thought time would fix it. Time again. I asked one question. Did you ever plan to tell me on your own? They hesitated. That hesitation answered everything. They talked about fear, fear of conflict, fear of losing control, fear of confronting resentment they didn't know how to articulate. They admitted they had convinced themselves they were justified, that they had rewritten the story in their head until it felt reasonable. Hearing that didn't bring relief, it brought clarity. I realized something important in that moment. People don't always betray you because they don't care. Sometimes they betray you because they care more about protecting themselves than protecting the relationship. That understanding didn't heal the wound, but it explained it. They didn't apologize fully, not yet, but the wall had cracked. I left that meeting knowing the story was changing direction, not toward resolution necessarily, but toward confrontation with truth. And I understood something else too. Forgiveness wouldn't be simple. It wouldn't be automatic. And it wouldn't come without accountability, because forgiveness without truth is just silence dressed up as peace. And I had already lived in silence long enough. After that second meeting, I didn't feel relieved. I felt unsettled, not because guilt had finally been acknowledged, but because it arrived incomplete. Partial truth has a strange effect. It opens wounds without cleaning them. It offers honesty without responsibility. For days after that conversation, I replayed every word, not searching for meaning but searching for what was missing. Guilt had been mentioned, but accountability hadn't. Fear had been explained, but repair hadn't. I realized then that acknowledgement is not the same as remorse. One recognizes discomfort, the other accepts consequence, and my sibling was still standing in between. We exchanged a few messages over the following weeks. Nothing confrontational, nothing deep either. There was a cautious politeness to everything, as if we were walking around broken glass, careful not to make anything worse, but also careful not to address the center of the room. That space between us felt heavier than before. At least earlier the silence was clear. Now it was complicated. I began asking myself harder questions, not about them but about me. What did I actually want? Did I want the inheritance returned exactly as it should have been? Or did I want acknowledgement that what happened was wrong, even if nothing was corrected financially? Was I seeking justice or closure? or something else entirely. The truth was uncomfortable. I wanted respect. I wanted my experience validated. I wanted to know that my trust hadn't been meaningless, that the pain wasn't dismissed as overreaction or weakness. Money could be replaced over time, but dignity could not. Eventually, I asked for another conversation, this time with no ambiguity. I told them I needed clarity, not explanations but intention. We met again, and this time I didn't soften my words. I told them how the silence affected me, how being excluded made me question my worth within the family, how betrayal reshaped my sense of safety. I didn't accuse, I described. They listened more quietly than before, less defensive, more exposed, and then something shifted. They admitted they had known it was wrong while it was happening, not afterward, not later. During, they said they felt a constant internal conflict between doing what was right and doing what felt easier. Easier one, hearing that hurt more than anything else they'd said so far, because it meant the betrayal wasn't ignorance. It was a choice made repeatedly. I asked why they never stopped, why they never paused long enough to reconsider. They said momentum took over, that once things started moving it felt impossible to undo, that fear of consequences outweighed conscience. They finally said the words I hadn't heard yet, I'm sorry, not perfectly, not eloquently, but sincerely enough that it couldn't be ignored. I didn't respond immediately, because apologies don't erase impact. They open a door but they don't walk you through it. I asked them what they thought forgiveness meant. They said moving on, putting it behind us, letting the past stay in the past. That answer told me we weren't aligned yet. I explained that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean pretending nothing happened. And it didn't mean avoiding consequences. Forgiveness meant acknowledging harm fully and accepting that repair might be uncomfortable. They struggled with that. I could see it. People often want forgiveness for relief, not responsibility. I asked whether they were willing to correct what they could, not out of obligation but out of integrity. That question hung in the air. They didn't answer right away. Weeks passed after that conversation. No follow-ups, no offers, no action, and I understood something clearly for the first time. Words alone were not enough for me. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't desperate. I was discerning. I decided to stop waiting for them to decide the outcome of my healing. I spoke with a legal advisor again, not to escalate but to prepare. Preparation changed how I felt, not empowered in an aggressive sense but grounded. Knowing I had options removed the feeling of helplessness. Around that time, I noticed my siblings' tone change again. They reached out more often, asked how I was, mentioned stress. Eventually, they admitted something they hadn't shared before. Managing the inheritance had become overwhelming. The responsibility they once wanted now felt heavy. They said they felt trapped by their own decisions. I listened, but I didn't rescue them emotionally. Then came the sentence that shifted everything. They said they wanted forgiveness because they couldn't live with the guilt anymore. That honesty mattered, but it also revealed motive. The forgiveness they sought was about their peace, not my healing. I told them that, gently but clearly. I said forgiveness wasn't a transaction. It wasn't something they could ask for without offering restoration. I explained that healing requires balance, that remorse without repair keeps wounds open. That conversation was difficult, but it was honest. For the first time, they didn't argue. They asked what repair would look like. I told them I needed transparency. I needed acknowledgement to others in the family. And I needed fairness addressed meaningfully, not symbolically. They said they needed time to think, time again, but this time felt different. I wasn't waiting anymore. I had already begun moving forward internally. I had accepted that forgiveness might come, or it might not. That reconciliation was possible, but not guaranteed. And that my peace didn't depend on their readiness. That realization was freeing. I slept better. I felt lighter, not because things were resolved, but because I was no longer chasing resolution. Weeks later, they came back with an offer. Not perfect, not complete, but real. They proposed correcting part of what had been taken. Not because they were forced, but because they said it was right. I didn't agree immediately. I took time, because forgiveness should never be rushed, and trust should never be rebuilt quickly. I knew something important then. Forgiveness wasn't the end of this story, it was the beginning of a much harder chapter, one where boundaries mattered, where accountability had to be sustained, where words would finally have to align with action, and where I would have to decide whether rebuilding something broken was worth the risk of being hurt again. That decision would change everything. When my sibling finally made an offer to correct part of what had been taken, I didn't feel relief. I felt cautious, not because the offer wasn't meaningful, but because I had learned something important through all of this. Intent matters, but patterns matter more. I took time before responding, not days but weeks. In the past, I would have rushed toward resolution. I would have believed effort alone was enough, but this experience had changed how I measured sincerity. I needed to see consistency, not urgency. During that time, I focused on my own life, not as an escape, but as grounding. I realized how much emotional energy I had given to something I couldn't control, how many hours I had spent replaying conversations, imagining outcomes, preparing for apologies that never came when I needed them. Letting go of that mental cycle didn't mean letting go of the situation. It meant reclaiming myself. I noticed my posture change, my tone, the way I spoke about the situation when people asked. I stopped explaining. I stopped justifying. I simply said there was a conflict and I was handling it in a way that honored me. That sentence felt powerful. Eventually, I agreed to another conversation, this time with clear boundaries. I told my sibling what forgiveness meant to me. I said forgiveness was not permission to repeat harm. It wasn't amnesia. It wasn't silence. Forgiveness meant I was willing to move forward without carrying bitterness if accountability was real and ongoing. They listened carefully, more carefully than before. They admitted they were afraid of losing access to me, afraid of being seen differently by the family, afraid of fully confronting what their actions said about them. That admission mattered because it wasn't self-protective, it was vulnerable. We talked about trust, not as something that returns, but as something rebuilt slowly in fragments. I told them trust would not come back quickly, that some doors would remain closed not as punishment but as protection. They accepted that. That acceptance was new. Still, I didn't feel ready to forgive fully, and that surprised me. I had always believed forgiveness came naturally once remorse was shown. But now I understood something deeper. Forgiveness is not an emotional reaction. It's a decision made when you're ready to release the role of victim without minimizing the harm done. And I wasn't there yet. I asked myself hard questions. Was I holding on to anger, or was I honoring the pace my healing required? Was I protecting myself or avoiding vulnerability again? The answers weren't clear, but they didn't need to be. Healing doesn't move on a schedule. The inheritance correction process began slowly. Paperwork, conversations, steps taken without fanfare. I watched closely, not for perfection but for consistency, and consistency showed up. Not dramatically but steadily. Still, the relationship remained distant, polite, respectful, careful. We were no longer pretending everything was fine. But we also weren't rebuilding closeness yet. That space was uncomfortable but honest. Family members noticed the shift. Some asked questions. Others avoided the topic entirely. I didn't defend my sibling, and I didn't attack them either. I let the truth exist without managing it for others. That was another change in me. I stopped carrying everyone else's comfort. As time passed, I noticed the anger fading, not because I forced it, but because it no longer served me. Anger had protected me when I needed clarity. Now it was releasing its grip naturally. One evening I realized something quietly. I hadn't thought about the inheritance all day, not the money, not the betrayal. I had thought about my work, my friendships, my future. That moment felt like progress. Forgiveness began taking shape, then not as a declaration, but as a softening. I wasn't excusing what happened. I wasn't forgetting. I was choosing not to let it define me. When I finally told my sibling that I was willing to forgive, I did so carefully. I said forgiveness didn't mean restoration of what we were. It meant I was willing to move forward without resentment. They cried, not dramatically, not manipulatively, quietly, And in that moment, I felt something unexpected. Peace, not because the story ended, but because I had reclaimed my agency. Forgiveness didn't make me smaller. It made me stronger, but forgiveness didn't erase consequences. Boundaries remained, distance remained, and that was okay. I learned that forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. One is internal. The other requires mutual effort. I was willing to forgive. Reconciliation would depend on time. As we moved forward, I watched carefully, not with suspicion, but with awareness. Trust is rebuilt when actions align with words over time without pressure. I didn't rush that process. I let it unfold naturally, and in doing so, I discovered something important about myself. I was capable of holding compassion without sacrificing self-respect. I was capable of letting go without erasing boundaries. And I was capable of redefining family not by blood alone, but by behavior. The inheritance was never the true loss. The loss was the illusion that love automatically equals safety. What I gained instead was discernment. And that was worth more than anything that had been taken. Forgiveness didn't arrive like a moment of relief. It arrived quietly, almost unnoticed. There was no dramatic shift in how I felt when I woke up. No sudden warmth toward my sibling. No sense that everything had been repaired. Instead, there was space. Space where anger used to sit. Space where constant vigilance had lived. Space where resentment no longer demanded attention. I learned quickly that forgiveness doesn't remove memory. It simply removes the emotional charge that once controlled it. I still remembered everything, the secrecy, the silence, the way decisions were made without me. But those memories no longer dictated my mood. They no longer followed me into unrelated moments of my life. That was new. My siblings seemed relieved by my willingness to forgive, too relieved at first. They reached out more often, suggested meeting, mentioned family gatherings. It became clear they believed forgiveness meant access. That assumption forced another conversation. I told them forgiveness did not equal closeness. It did not reset the relationship to what it once was, and it did not erase the need for boundaries. They struggled with that distinction. People often believe forgiveness is something that benefits both sides equally. But the truth is forgiveness primarily benefits the person who offers it. Reconciliation benefits both, but only when trust is rebuilt. I explained that rebuilding trust would take time, and that pushing for closeness would slow the process rather than speed it. To their credit, they listened, this time without defensiveness, without justification. They acknowledged that they had expectations about how forgiveness should look. They admitted those expectations were shaped by their discomfort, not my healing. That honesty mattered. Slowly, we began interacting differently, not as siblings reclaiming closeness, but as two adults learning how to exist in a new reality. Conversations stayed light. Boundaries stayed firm. And I felt surprisingly comfortable with that. There were moments of sadness, not sharp but reflective. I missed the version of us that existed before all of this, the simplicity, the assumption of loyalty. But I no longer mourned it daily. I accepted that some relationships evolve not forward but sideways, and that evolution doesn't have to be tragic. As time passed, I noticed something else change: my sense of self. I trusted myself more, not others less, but myself more. I trusted my instincts. I trusted my boundaries. I trusted my ability to walk away from situations that didn't feel right. That confidence hadn't existed before. Before I equated trust with openness, with giving the benefit of the doubt. Now I understood trust as something built gradually through consistency and accountability. That shift affected every area of my life. I spoke up sooner. I asked clearer questions. I noticed patterns instead of dismissing them, and I stopped apologizing for needing clarity. One evening I realized something unexpected. I felt grateful. Not for what happened, but for what it taught me. Without this experience, I might have continued assuming people would always act in good faith simply because they shared history with me. I might have continued ignoring discomfort to preserve harmony. This situation had forced me to mature emotionally in ways I hadn't anticipated. My sibling noticed the change too. They commented once that I seemed different, stronger. I didn't disagree. Still, forgiveness did not remove accountability. There were moments when old habits resurfaced, moments when they avoided uncomfortable topics, moments when transparency wavered. Each time I addressed it calmly, no anger, no accusation, just clarity. And each time they corrected themselves more quickly. That consistency mattered. Trust wasn't returning quickly, but it was beginning to take shape in fragments. I didn't romanticize it. I didn't rush it. I allowed the relationship to be what it was, not what I wished it could be. Family gatherings were awkward at first. Polite smiles, careful distance, but gradually the tension softened. Not because everything was resolved, but because honesty had replaced pretense. Other family members noticed the shift. Some asked questions, others respected the silence. I didn't feel the need to explain anymore. My healing didn't require an audience. One day, months later, my sibling thanked me. Not for forgiveness, but for holding them accountable without cruelty. That sentence stayed with me. It affirmed something important. Boundaries don't have to be harsh to be effective. Compassion doesn't require self-sacrifice. And forgiveness doesn't mean minimizing harm. I realized that what I had offered wasn't absolution. It was an opportunity for growth, for repair, for honesty. Whether they continued to honor that opportunity was up to them. My responsibility ended with my integrity. Looking back, I understood that the inheritance was never the true conflict. The true conflict was about power and fear and avoidance. Money simply exposed it. And while I would never choose to experience that kind of betrayal again, I no longer viewed it only as loss. It had reshaped how I relate to others, how I protect myself, how I forgive. Forgiveness became something I offered from strength, not obligation. And that distinction changed everything. As time moved forward, I stopped defining my sibling by their worst decision. Not because it didn't matter, but because people are more than their failures when they choose to take responsibility for them. That choice is what separates remorse from regret. I didn't know how the story would end completely, whether closeness would ever return, whether trust would fully rebuild, but I was no longer afraid of uncertainty. I had learned that I could survive disappointment without losing myself, and that lesson was permanent. Time has a way of testing whether change is real, not days, not weeks, but months of ordinary moments where no one is watching closely. That is where truth shows itself. After forgiveness was spoken out loud, after boundaries were clearly set, life moved into something quieter. There were no dramatic conversations anymore, no emotional confrontations. Just normal interactions layered with awareness. And I paid attention, not obsessively but honestly. I watched how my sibling handled small things, how they communicated, how they followed through, how they respected limits without resentment. Because real change shows up in the details. At first, everything felt careful, almost scripted. They checked in before making decisions that involved me. They asked instead of assumed. They explained instead of avoided. That effort mattered, but I knew consistency mattered more. I didn't praise it. I didn't criticize it either. I simply observed. I learned something important during this phase. Forgiveness doesn't mean trust returns immediately, but it does create a space where trust can slowly grow again if actions support it. That space felt fragile but possible. There were moments when I felt tempted to move faster, to relax boundaries, to pretend the past was far behind us, but I resisted that urge, not out of fear but out of respect for my own healing. I understood now that boundaries are not walls. They are guidelines that protect growth. Without them, forgiveness can turn into self-betrayal. I noticed how my sibling responded when boundaries stayed firm. At first, there was discomfort, subtle frustration, a desire for reassurance, then gradually acceptance. They stopped pushing, stopped testing. That shift told me something had changed internally. They were no longer trying to escape guilt. They were learning to live responsibly with it, and that mattered. Family events became less tense over time, not warm but manageable. We existed in the same spaces without emotional charge. That alone felt like progress. I didn't seek private closeness, and neither did they. We allowed the relationship to find its own pace. Sometimes that pace felt slow, other times it felt just right. I realized something unexpected during this period. I no longer needed an apology repeated. The first sincere one had been enough. What I needed now was alignment, and alignment was happening quietly. Still, there were moments that stirred old feelings. A comment said carelessly, a memory triggered unexpectedly, a reminder of how easily things had gone wrong. When that happened, I didn't suppress it. I acknowledged it internally, then let it pass. Healing doesn't mean never feeling pain again. It means pain no longer controls your behavior. One evening, I found myself reflecting on how far I had come, not in terms of the situation, but in terms of myself. I had learned how to sit with discomfort without reacting impulsively. I had learned how to speak truth calmly without softening it to keep peace. I had learned that forgiveness is strongest when it is chosen freely, not pressured by family expectations or guilt. Those lessons stayed with me. They changed how I handled other relationships too. I became more selective, more intentional. I stopped confusing familiarity with safety. I realized that trust must be earned continually, even within families. That realization didn't make me cynical, it made me grounded. There was one moment, small but significant, that confirmed real change. My sibling made a decision that affected both of us, something minor but meaningful. This time they came to me first, not to inform but to ask. That distinction mattered. They waited for my input, respected my response, adjusted accordingly. They didn't mention the past, didn't over-explain, didn't seek praise. They simply did the right thing. I noticed my body relax in a way it hadn't before. Trust doesn't return as certainty. It returns as a quiet absence of tension. That moment told me the relationship had moved into a new phase, not restored but redefined. We would never be what we once were, and that was okay. What we were becoming was something more honest. I no longer idealized the bond. I accepted it realistically, and in doing so, I released expectations that had once set me up for pain. I realized something else too. Forgiveness had freed me from needing my sibling to be different for me to be okay. Whether they continued to grow or made future mistakes, I trusted myself to respond appropriately. That confidence was new. Before I feared conflict. Now I trusted my resilience. That trust in myself was the true gift of this experience. I didn't feel superior. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. Steady enough to hold compassion without sacrificing boundaries. Steady enough to allow closeness slowly without forcing it. Steady enough to accept uncertainty without anxiety. Time continued to pass. The inheritance became less central to our interactions, not because it was forgotten, but because it no longer defined us. What defined us now was how we treated each other moving forward, and that was a choice made daily. I understood that forgiveness doesn't guarantee a happy ending, but it does allow for a healthier one, and health is sometimes better than happiness. I didn't know yet how the story would conclude, whether trust would deepen or remain limited. But I knew one thing for certain. I would never again sacrifice my voice for the illusion of harmony. That lesson would stay with me forever. By the time enough months had passed for the intensity to fade, something unexpected happened. The story stopped dominating my thoughts, not because it no longer mattered, but because it no longer demanded constant attention. That was when I realized healing had moved from effort to reality. There were still moments when the past surfaced. A sentence someone said casually, a memory triggered without warning, a reminder of how fragile trust can be. But those moments no longer pulled me under. They came, they registered, and they passed. I didn't spiral anymore. I didn't rehearse conversations in my head. I didn't imagine alternate endings. I had accepted that the ending would unfold on its own timeline, and that my role was no longer to control it. I noticed how different my emotional landscape felt. Before I was vigilant, scanning for signs of disrespect, bracing for disappointment. Now I was present, not naive but grounded. I had learned the difference. My sibling continued showing consistency. Not perfection, but effort without performance. They didn't bring up forgiveness often. They didn't ask for reassurance. They didn't push for closeness. They allowed the relationship to exist where it was, and that restraint mattered more than words ever could. We spoke occasionally, shared updates, exchanged neutral warmth. It wasn't the closeness we once had, but it was honest. I realized that many people confuse healing with reconciliation. They assume healing requires restoring everything that was lost. But healing can exist even when relationships remain changed. That understanding gave me peace. I no longer felt pressure to rebuild something just because it once existed. I let the relationship be what it was capable of being now, not what nostalgia demanded. That freedom was subtle but powerful. I also noticed how this experience had changed my empathy. I became more patient with people who struggled with accountability, not because I excused harm, but because I understood how fear and avoidance can drive destructive choices. At the same time, I became firmer about my boundaries. Compassion without boundaries is self-neglect. Boundaries without compassion are walls. I had learned to balance both. There was a moment simple but revealing that confirmed how far things had come. My sibling acknowledged the situation publicly within the family, not dramatically, not defensively. They took responsibility without minimizing. They didn't justify. They didn't shift blame. They simply owned it. That mattered, not because I needed validation from others, but because accountability expressed openly reflects internal change. I didn't feel triumphant hearing it. I felt calm, as if something unfinished had finally settled. I noticed family dynamics shift after that. Conversations felt lighter, tension softened. No one pretended the past hadn't happened, but it no longer hovered unspoken. Silence had been replaced by truth, and that changed the atmosphere. I reflected often during that period, not with regret but with curiosity. I asked myself what this experience had taught me about love. I realized love without honesty becomes fragile, love without boundaries becomes unsafe, and love without accountability becomes hollow. Real love requires courage, courage to be transparent, courage to face discomfort, courage to repair harm rather than avoid it. Those lessons extended beyond family. They influenced friendships, work relationships, romantic connections. I stopped ignoring red flags because of history. I stopped over-explaining my needs. I stopped accepting confusion where clarity was possible. And I stopped believing that endurance equals loyalty. Loyalty without respect is not loyalty. It is self-abandonment. That realization alone changed how I lived. There were still moments of sadness. Not sharp but reflective. I grieved the version of my sibling I thought I had, the uncomplicated bond, the untested trust, but I also appreciated the version of myself that emerged from this experience. More aware, more confident, more honest. I realized that I hadn't just forgiven my sibling. I had forgiven myself for not seeing it sooner, for trusting easily, for believing that shared history guaranteed shared values. That self-forgiveness mattered more than anything else. Without it, I would have remained stuck in self-blame. With it, I felt whole again. I also learned that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting the lesson. It means remembering it without resentment. I would never again ignore discomfort for the sake of peace. I would never again assume silence meant safety. Those lessons were now part of me. As time continued, the inheritance itself faded further into the background. Not because it was insignificant, but because its role in my identity had ended. I no longer defined the experience by what was taken, but by what was gained: perspective, discernment, strength. I understood now that some experiences don't come to break you, they come to refine you. Even when they hurt deeply, I didn't know how the future relationship with my sibling would look, whether trust would deepen further or remain limited, but I was no longer anxious about that outcome. I trusted myself to adapt. That trust in myself was something no one could take away, and that was the quiet victory of this story. Something changed without announcing itself. There was no conversation, no realization that arrived all at once, no dramatic turning point. It happened quietly in the middle of an ordinary day. I noticed that I was no longer waiting, not waiting for another apology, not waiting for reassurance, not waiting for proof that things would be okay. I was simply living. That awareness stopped me for a moment. For years, even after forgiveness, a part of me had still been paused, waiting for closure to feel complete, waiting for the relationship to make sense, waiting for the past to fully release its grip. And suddenly, I wasn't doing that anymore. The story no longer ran in the background of my mind. It had become something I remembered, not something I carried. I realized then that healing doesn't end with forgiveness. It ends when you reclaim your attention. My attention had returned to my own life, to my routines, my goals, my sense of direction. I was no longer measuring progress by how my sibling behaved. I was measuring it by how I felt, and I felt steady. There were still interactions, still moments of contact, but they no longer defined my emotional state. If my sibling was distant, I didn't internalize it. If they were warm, I appreciated it without attaching expectation. That balance was new. Before, every interaction felt loaded, a test, a sign, a symbol. Now it was just interaction. I realized how much energy I had spent interpreting behavior in the past, trying to decode meaning, trying to anticipate disappointment, trying to protect myself by predicting outcomes. That vigilance had once felt necessary. Now it felt unnecessary. I trusted my ability to respond if something went wrong. I didn't need to stay on guard anymore. That trust brought peace. I noticed how this shift affected my body. My shoulders felt lighter, my breathing deeper, my sleep more restful. Stress I hadn't realized I was carrying had slowly released. Emotional weight often leaves quietly. You don't feel it go until one day you realize it's gone. I also noticed something else. My sibling no longer occupied a central role in my internal narrative. They were no longer the lesson, the cautionary tale, the unresolved chapter. They were simply a person in my life with a defined place. That place wasn't small, but it wasn't consuming. I realized that true forgiveness is not about generosity toward others. It is about freedom for yourself. I had given myself that freedom. There was a moment unexpected that confirmed this internal shift. My sibling made a mistake, not related to the past but noticeable. Old me would have reacted instantly, interpreted it as a sign, felt tension rise. This time I noticed it, acknowledged it, and waited. They corrected it on their own. No drama, no confrontation needed. I felt nothing spike inside me, no fear, no anger, just calm observation. That was when I knew the wound was no longer in control. I reflected on how much I had learned about power through this experience. Not power over others, but power over my own reactions. I had learned that you cannot control who hurts you, but you can control whether that hurt defines you. I had learned that boundaries are not punishments. They are expressions of self-respect. I had learned that forgiveness is not forgetting, and it is not excusing. It is choosing not to carry resentment forward. I had learned that people can change, but change must be observed, not imagined. And I had learned that closure is not something someone gives you. It is something you grant yourself. That realization changed how I approached life. I stopped waiting for perfect conditions before moving forward. I stopped holding space for apologies that might never come. I stopped anchoring my peace to other people's growth. I allowed myself to be whole, even if others remained imperfect. That freedom was profound. There were moments of gratitude too, not gratitude for what happened, but gratitude for what it revealed. It revealed my strength, my capacity for honesty, my ability to choose integrity over bitterness. I realized that this experience had sharpened my intuition. I trusted myself more now. I noticed patterns sooner. I spoke up earlier. I listened to discomfort instead of dismissing it. That awareness felt like a quiet protection. I was no longer afraid of being hurt again, not because I believed it wouldn't happen, but because I believed I could handle it. That confidence didn't make me closed off. It made me open without being exposed. There was still room for connection, still room for forgiveness, still room for love, just not at the cost of my well-being. I also realized that forgiveness had changed how I viewed justice. Justice isn't always about equal outcomes. It's about internal alignment. I had aligned my actions with my values: honesty, accountability, compassion, self-respect. That alignment brought peace no external outcome could replace. I didn't need to feel vindicated. I didn't need others to take sides. I needed to live in a way that felt true, and I was doing that. As time continued, the relationship with my siblings settled into a stable rhythm. Not dramatic, not intense. Just present. We shared space without tension. We communicated without fear. We didn't pretend the past hadn't happened, but we didn't relive it either. It existed where it belonged, in the past. I understood now that reconciliation doesn't always look like closeness. Sometimes it looks like mutual respect at a healthy distance, and that can be enough. I stopped measuring success by how close we became. I measured it by how peaceful I felt, and peace had returned fully. I was no longer waiting for the story to end. I had already stepped into the next chapter, one defined not by loss but by clarity, not by resentment but by resilience, not by what was taken but by what was learned. And that was the moment I knew this experience no longer owned me. When people ask how the story ends, I pause, not because I don't know the answer, but because the ending isn't what they expect. There is no dramatic reunion, no moment where everything feels restored, no scene where the past disappears completely. What remains is quieter than that, but stronger. What remains is clarity. I no longer wake up with questions looping in my mind. I no longer replay conversations that never happened. I no longer imagine alternate versions of events where things turned out differently. I live in what is not what should have been. That shift changed everything. The inheritance itself, once such a heavy symbol, now feels distant. Not forgotten but redefined. It no longer represents loss. It represents a turning point, a moment where I learned what truly belongs to me and what never did. Money can be taken, trust can be broken, relationships can fracture, but self-respect once claimed cannot be stolen. I learned that the hardest part of betrayal isn't what you lose externally, it's the internal disorientation. The moment you realize someone you trusted deeply was capable of causing you harm. That realization shakes your sense of reality. But surviving it and choosing integrity afterward restores something even stronger. I didn't emerge unscarred, but I emerged aware. Awareness became my anchor. I became more honest with myself, about what I tolerate, about what I need, about what I value. I stopped romanticizing family bonds at the expense of truth. I stopped believing that blood guarantees loyalty. I started believing in demonstrated character. That belief guided my decisions going forward. There were moments when guilt tried to return, moments when I wondered if I should have done more, given more chances, softened boundaries, but each time I returned to the same truth. Boundaries were not punishment, they were protection, not just for me, but for the relationship itself. Without them, resentment would have grown quietly. With them, respect had space to exist. I realized something important about forgiveness. Forgiveness is not a gift you give once. It is a choice you reaffirm through consistent self-respect. I forgave my sibling, but I also forgave myself for needing distance. That self-forgiveness brought relief. I didn't owe anyone access to my inner world. Access is earned through safety. That understanding freed me. Over time, my sibling remained consistent, not perfect but accountable. They didn't try to rewrite history, they didn't minimize harm, they didn't demand closeness. They accepted the relationship as it was. That acceptance mattered. It told me they had stopped trying to control the outcome and had started respecting the process. And so had I. We existed in a new form of family, less idealized, more real. I didn't feel bitterness toward them. I didn't feel superiority. I felt neutrality with a quiet undercurrent of compassion. I understood that people often act from fear, from insecurity, from unresolved wounds. Understanding that didn't excuse behavior, but it softened my heart. I no longer needed to judge them harshly. I also didn't need to justify myself. Both things can coexist, compassion and accountability. That balance felt mature. I realized that this experience had changed how I define forgiveness. Forgiveness is not about reconciliation at any cost. It is about refusing to let pain define your future. It is about choosing peace without erasing truth. It is about releasing resentment without releasing discernment. That distinction matters. I also realized something else. Sometimes the greatest closure comes not from conversations, but from how you live afterward. I lived differently. I spoke more directly. I trusted my instincts. I walked away sooner from situations that felt wrong. I no longer mistook discomfort for something to endure. I listened to it, and my life became calmer because of it. The relationship with my sibling settled into its final form, not dramatic, not broken, not repaired completely, just honest. We shared holidays, conversations, updates, without pretense, without expectations, without emotional debt. That was enough. I didn't need the relationship to prove anything. I didn't need it to validate my healing. My healing existed independently now. I also noticed that I stopped telling the story often, not because it hurt, but because it no longer defined me. It became part of my history, not my identity. I had moved on without running away. That distinction felt important. Moving on doesn't mean forgetting. It means integrating the experience into who you are without letting it control you. That is what I had done. If there is one thing I learned above all else, it is this. You can forgive someone and still choose yourself. You can love someone and still say no. You can honor family without sacrificing your truth. And you can heal even if the relationship never returns to what it was. The ending of this story is not dramatic. It is steady. I wake up without resentment. I move through life without fear. I trust myself fully. And that is more than I ever expected to gain. This experience took something from me, but it gave me something greater: clarity, strength, and a deep understanding of my own worth. That is what remains. And that is how the story truly ends.